Panama receives more rainfall than almost any inhabited point on Earth where humans have chosen to build a major piece of infrastructure. The jungle that flanks the canal averages more than 2 meters of rain per year. The Atlantic and Pacific press in from either side. And yet, in the fall of 2023, ships began lining up and waiting. No geopolitical crisis, no mechanical failure, just not enough water. The canal was rationing ships. The world's most important maritime shortcut was turning vessels away. The answer to why requires understanding something that most people who use the phrase Panama Canal have never considered. The canal does not use ocean water, not a single drop. Every ship that crosses uses fresh water, tens of millions of gallons per transit, drawn from a man-made lake in the Panamanian interior. When it stops raining, that lake drops. When the lake drops, the canal slows down. And when the canal slows down, the world notices. The canal is commonly described as a shortcut between oceans. That framing is accurate and completely misleading. A shortcut implies travel at sea level from one side to the other. But the land between the Atlantic and Pacific isn't flat. At its center, it rises roughly 26 meters above sea level, about the height of an 8-story building. Ships don't go around this ridge, they go over it. The mechanism is a system of locks, giant water-filled chambers that function like staircases. A ship enters the first lock at sea level. The chamber fills with fresh water until the ship rises to the next level. 3 sets of locks on the Atlantic side, 3 on the Pacific. The ship climbs to Gatun Lake at the center, crosses 24 miles of that lake, then descends on the other side. Simple in principle, staggering in execution. Each time a large container ship passes through, roughly 52 million gallons of fresh water flow from the lock chambers into the ocean, not recycled, not reused, gone. Every single transit draws down the lake. At 36 to 38 ships per day, the canal consumes fresh water at a rate that's hard to picture. But here's the problem. The lake that feeds the locks, Gatun Lake, was created in 1913 by damming the Chagres River and flooding a valley in the Panamanian interior. It covers 425 square kilometers. When it was completed, it was the largest man-made lake on Earth. It exists for one purpose: to supply water to the locks. The design is self-contained. The locks don't pump water uphill. Gravity does the work. The lake sits above both oceans. Water flows down from the lake into the lock chambers. Ships rise with it. The real engineering challenge isn't the lift. It's the management of the flow. What makes the system function is rainfall. The Chagres River watershed, covering roughly 300 square kilometers of jungle north of the canal, catches rain and channels it into the lake. In a normal year, Panama's wet season replenishes what the lock cycles drain. The system is a flow-through design. The lake constantly drains and constantly refills. The whole thing works as long as rainfall keeps pace with transits. Nobody talks about what this actually requires. For most of the 20th century, that condition held. The canal opened in 1914. Traffic grew steadily. Expansions added capacity. The system worked so reliably that its fundamental dependence on rainfall faded from the analysis entirely. Rainfall was treated not as a variable, but as a constant. In the fall of 2023, Gatun Lake dropped to levels without precedent in the canal's peacetime operation. The Panama Canal Authority imposed draft restrictions. Ships could only load to a fraction of capacity, reducing how deep they sat in the water, limiting how much cargo they could carry. Then daily transit slots were cut from 36 to 38 per day, down to a low of 22. A backlog of over 130 vessels formed at both ends of the canal simultaneously. That backlog had a price. The Canal Authority had seen drought stress before. In 1997-98, during a severe El Nino event, restrictions were imposed and engineers drew explicit lessons. The expanded Neo-Panamax locks, completed in 2016, included water-saving systems, side chambers that recapture roughly 60% of each cycle's water for reuse. Additional water capture infrastructure was built throughout the Chagres watershed. By 2020, the authority had reasonable grounds to believe the vulnerability had been addressed. It hadn't. The 2023 drought arrived as a compound event. El Nino layered on top of what looks like a permanent shift in rainfall patterns across Central America, not a temporary disruption, a new baseline. The water-saving basins helped, but they were engineered around historical rainfall averages that no longer described the system they were embedded in. Had been designed as a worst-case buffer became the ordinary operating condition. The Neo-Panamax expansion was a $5, $25 billion investment approved in 2007, designed specifically to future-proof the canal's capacity. The new locks accommodate vessels too wide for the original chambers, ships that carry 3 times the cargo per transit. But those ships also displace more water per crossing. The expansion that was meant to secure the canal's economic future sharpened its hydrological exposure at the same time. The planners were not negligent. They were solving for known constraints. Climate, in 2007, was not yet a variable that major infrastructure finance routinely priced in. The water-saving basins brought per-transit consumption down significantly. But the lake kept dropping, which raised a question no one in the global shipping industry had a clean answer to. What happens when Gatun Lake stops being reliable? Put the canal in its global context. It handles roughly 5% of world seaborne trade by volume, but a much larger share of specific, economically critical categories. Container cargo moving from East Asia to the U.S. East Coast. Grain from the American Midwest bound for Asian markets. Liquefied natural gas from Gulf terminals to European buyers who, in 2023, were still rebuilding supply chains away from Russian gas. The detour around South America, Cape Horn, adds approximately 2 weeks and, for large container vessels, somewhere between $700 and $1 million in additional costs per voyage. Some carriers in 2023 rerouted through Suez instead. Spot shipper rates spiked. The effects landed in commodity prices, in delivery delays, in the margins of agricultural exporters with tight seasonal windows. Soybeans harvested in October have a market timing problem if they take an extra 3 weeks to reach a buyer in Asia. 1/40th of all world trade. One lake, one river system. The canal connects oceans, but that's the easy description. It structures the economics of global supply chains around an assumption of reliable transit. When that assumption breaks, the ripple effects are not uniform. Large carriers have the capital and fleet flexibility to reroute. Smaller operators and exporters locked into fixed contracts absorb the loss directly. The canal is, in practical terms, a subsidy to global trade efficiency, invisible when it works, expensive when it doesn't. If you want to understand how global trade actually breaks, not in headlines, in the mechanics, the like helps this reach people who should see it. This tells you something about critical infrastructure that rarely gets stated plainly. The most dangerous single points of failure are the ones that have functioned reliably long enough that people stop thinking of them as points of failure at all. The canal has operated for over a century. That track record created an expectation of permanence, that the underlying system never actually warranted. The Canal Authority does not control the rainfall. It controls the rate of transits and the draft limits, essentially how fast the lake drains. But replenishment is outside its jurisdiction in every meaningful sense. The Chagres watershed, the land that actually catches the rain and feeds the lake, is under competing pressures: agricultural expansion, deforestation, urban development. The Canal Authority has acquired land in critical catchment zones specifically to prevent development, investing hundreds of millions in watershed conservation. But the corridor around Gatun Lake is not uninhabited, and communities that live within that watershed have economic needs that exist independently of global shipping schedules. Balancing conservation against those needs is not an optimization problem that engineers can solve unilaterally. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The canal is effectively consuming a shared Panamanian natural resource. Fresh water from a specific finite watershed to subsidize the efficiency of global shipping. The revenues flow back to Panama, roughly $2 billion annually to the government in recent years. But the water doesn't flow back. The decisions to expand traffic, accommodate larger ships, and accept higher per-transit water consumption were made in service of throughput and revenue. They were rational under historical climate assumptions. Under current ones, that logic needs re-examining. The question that actually matters: is the Panama Canal Authority managing a natural resource responsibly, or managing a revenue stream that happens to depend on one? The answer has real consequences for how the canal gets governed over the next 50 years. The authority has studies underway: a new reservoir deeper in the watershed, a desalination plant, pipeline from a river system outside the Chagres drainage. Each carries a price tag in the billions and a construction timeline measured in decades. None have moved past the study stage. Meanwhile, Gatun Lake is monitored each year like a patient whose vitals are slightly off but not yet critical. And the ships keep arriving. The deeper question isn't whether the canal can survive the next drought. It probably can, with restrictions. The deeper question is what it means when one of the most important nodes in global trade is running on a water balance that no longer has the margin it used to, and when the fallback infrastructure remains on paper. The Panama Canal is often called an engineering marvel. It is. But the engineering isn't what's under pressure. The locks are mechanically reliable. The concrete is solid. The control systems work. What's under pressure is the assumption embedded in the original design that the climate surrounding the canal would remain stable enough for the engineering to function as intended. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. When the canal's designers chose the lock and lake system over a sea level alternative, a genuine debate in the early 1900s, they chose it partly because the Chagres River watershed appeared to be an effectively inexhaustible source of fresh water. The word inexhaustible appears in engineering reports from 1906. It was a reasonable characterization given the data available at the time, but it was foundational. When that assumption changes, everything built on it changes too. That assumption is now under review across a wide range of infrastructure systems, not just this one. The Colorado River Water Allocation Framework was designed around early 20th century rainfall averages that overstated what the river would reliably deliver over the long run. Nuclear plants built with specific river flow requirements for cooling water are operating in rivers that regularly fall short. City water supplies, flood levees, irrigation networks. The engineering is often adequate, The climate data the engineering was built on often isn't. The canal isn't uniquely exposed. It was among the first major cases where the gap between design assumption and current climate reality became visible at a scale large enough to move global commodity markets. It is, in that sense, a preview. One detail that stuck in reviewing the canal's history: engineering debates of 1906 and 1907 were exhaustive. The Americans studied French failure. They ran surveys. They modeled costs. They got the engineering right. They spent almost no time on the climate because the climate in 1906, with no satellite data, no global temperature record, no concept of anthropogenic warming, was not a category of risk. It was backdrop. It's worth recognizing that the people who built the canal were not incautious. They were working with what they had. The problem isn't that they got it wrong. The problem is that we inherited the assumption without inheriting the caveat. If you want to understand the other places where the global economy is quietly running on outdated assumptions, rivers, ports, supply chains built for a climate that no longer exists, subscribe. That's what Mapped is for. Will the Canal Authority have new water infrastructure online before the next major drought forces deeper restrictions? Comment yes or no, because the timeline of construction and the timeline of climate change are not moving at the same speed. 40th of world trade, one lake, one watershed. Every year, the Shagri system delivers normal rainfall, the backlog clears, transit numbers recover, and the shipping industry moves on. Every drought year gets logged as an anomaly, a temporary disruption, a news story that fades. The question is, at what point a pattern of anomalies stops being a pattern and starts being the baseline? The 2023 drought made legible is something engineers and hydrologists had understood for years, but the markets had priced out of their models. The Panama Canal is not, at its core, a machine. It is a watershed that someone had the idea to build a machine on top of. And watersheds don't come with service contracts. There is a second story embedded in this one about the Suez Canal, its vulnerabilities, and why the two choke points are not interchangeable backups when one goes down. That one is next.